Okay, well, I think we'll give you guys a couple more minutes to find your seats and make your way back from lunch and so forth. And then we will have one set of slides, and then we'll move into a roundtable discussion. Let's see. Seems like mostly people are back now. To my left, your right, Sylvie, Falk, Nina, Christian, and Philip, and Martin. We will start with some slides from Philip, so why don't you go on ahead, talking about AT&T's position on many of these matters, and then we'll go into a discussion.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to the OECD and berec for extending an invitation to AT&T to participate in this workshop. Really do appreciate it. I'm happy to be here. It's my first time in Belgium, and I've had an excellent stay so far, despite being deadly tired. So I am going to give sort of the AT&T US perspective on internet interconnection. I'm going to talk about a little bit about AT&T's network and what we do, some internet traffic trends that we're seeing, interconnection trends related to the traffic trends that we see, and then get into a little bit of regulatory policy and talk a little bit about the FCC's open internet order and regulating it, internet interconnection. So AT&T, we operate a multi-purpose global network. We're a fixed ISP serving approximately 16 million subscribers. That may sound like a lot. We're the third largest in the United States, next to Comcast and Charter. They have roughly 23 and 25 million broadband or fixed customers. So we're third. We're also a mobile ISP. We provide other services such as corporate VPNs, website hosting. We're a carrier's carrier, including transit for other fixed and mobile ISPs. And we're a supplier also of voice services and various wholesale voice services in addition to retail. Providing all these services basically means that on a given business day, the AT&T network carries about 126 petabytes of data traffic. It's quite substantial, and carrying that much data requires AT&T to interconnect with other IP networks in large-scale fashion. In certain cases, facilities are used for the services that we provide, and they're separated logically over that same facility. In some cases, there's a dedicated facility that may be used exclusively for peering or transit or on net only. And this also requires, when we interconnect with other IP networks, thousands of 10 gigabit or equivalent interconnections to make that happen. And we do that via peering or on-net only. I say on-net only, a commonly familiar term to most people may be paid peering. That's a service in which is predominantly sold to content-rich entities, CDNs, and content providers that have very large amounts of content that they're distributing over the network and getting to consumers. So what we're seeing on internet traffic trends, big surprise. Continued growth in internet traffic. Surprise number 2, the driver is video. Obviously, that's not a surprise. But some interesting points here about video traffic, and what we see is that the busy hour traffic is growing much faster than the average hour traffic, and I'll get into a little bit more specifics on that in a future slide. And then over half of the busy hour is attributable to two providers, very successful services that they provide over the internet, Netflix and Google. On the Google side, it's primarily the YouTube video service. We're also seeing that mobile broadband consumption is growing faster than fixed consumption. However, fixed consumption still remains far greater than mobile. Large content providers, what we're seeing with this trend in video traffic driving the growth is that large content providers are doing a DIY or deploying their own CDN service as a more efficient means of getting their services directly to the consumers that are demanding it. The industry, despite all this change, continues to, as it has since the inception of the internet, to accommodate this growth on commercial terms. And we're also seeing signs of a very healthy market that transit and CDN services both are highly competitive, and we're seeing price declines in both of those services as well. This is more of a gee whiz slide. If even that, it's no surprise. It's just global internet traffic, IP traffic growth. The blue line is North America, orange line is Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. This is from a couple of Cisco VNI reports. And I mentioned earlier that the busy hour traffic is growing at a rate of 50% faster than the average hour traffic. And this is important because networks scale their networks based on busy hour consumption. And this is obviously being driven by video viewing that's occurring during the prime time hours in the evening. And you can see on the chart below, this is a global figure here of how fast busy hour is growing. That's the blue line with the sharper curve, and the average hour at 25% average growth rate. And the busy hour is dominated by video. If you look at this Sandvine chart here from their 2016 Global Internet Phenomenon, the top 10 application providers during the peak period, as I mentioned, Netflix and YouTube occupy about 50% of that space in aggregate, upstream and downstream. But you see other video players there as well, Amazon, iTunes, and Hulu. And so this is driving a trend where we see networks deploying their own CDNs. Once upon a time, content providers would hire a CDN that maybe sat behind a peer of AT&T's or was directly connected to AT&T over an on-net only connection. But we're seeing a shift from that. It's not that CDN service is not growing, but we're seeing a shift from high volume content networks deploying their own services. They've become a lot more sophisticated from when they were in their infancy in providing services. They know a lot about their user patterns. They know a lot about how to distribute their traffic most efficiently, where to place their server, where to put the repeatable content, where to put the not so repeatable long tail content. And so this has increased the demand for on-net only connections or paid peering connections. And it's a substantial amount of AT&T's interconnection arrangements. And you can see here on this chart below showing the traffic this is from a Cisco VNI report as well, and it's a global figure that in 2016 we're about 50-50 of CDN delivered traffic versus non-CDN delivered traffic. That's forecasted to go to 2020 where 65% will be delivered via CDN versus 35%. Again, video being the primary growth driver. We're also seeing competition in the transit market. This is a chart that was put together based on a survey that Bill Norton, he calls himself Dr. Peering. If you haven't heard of Dr. Peering or Bill Norton, he has a fantastic website that explains a lot of the concepts behind peering transit, the decisions to go from maybe purchasing transit to entering into a peering arrangement. Very helpful. But what we're seeing here is transit prices decline significantly, even year over year. We're seeing 25 to 30% decline in prices. I don't have a chart for this, but I do mention it on the next slide that CDN prices are also continuing to decline. I'm just going to skip to that point right now because it's pertinent to the competitive nature of transit as well. Dan Rayburn is another industry guru who specializes in the CDN market. He did a similar survey that Bill Norton does to transit providers to understand transit pricing, and Dan is seeing a 20% decline for 2015 and expects a 20 to 25% decline in 2016. What we're seeing as far as the interconnection ecosystem, we're seeing that it's proven to be resilient and adaptable. Networks and interconnection arrangements continue to be rapidly augmented to accommodate this growth. New agreements, both peering and on-net only agreements are being struck in order to accommodate the demands, both economically and flexibly. Have there been a couple of hiccups or bumps in the road? Sure, but I attribute that to some of these agreements that were negotiated in the late 90s that did not really have terms that accounted for the type of growth that networks have been seeing. So as I mentioned, signs of a healthy ecosystem are competition. We're seeing that in the transit and CDN business and the pricing declines. We're also seeing that peering and on-net only connections will move from 10 gigabits to 100 gigabits. And the interconnection pricing has followed costs and depends on several variables, volume and time pattern of traffic, required length of haul. Is the traffic being handed off at the closest peering point, or is it being delivered on a cold potato basis where it's being delivered at the location, the peering location closest to the destination? And also a variable is whether the carriage is on-net or off-net and the location and quantity of interconnection. So moving straight into regulatory policy, as everyone I'm sure knows, in 2015, for the first time, the FCC regulated, in the Open Internet Order, regulated internet traffic exchange and proposes to apply a light touch to it. In that order, the FCC found that broadband internet access service includes internet traffic exchange. The reasoning is that ISPs make a representation to the purchaser that they will connect the purchaser to virtually all or substantially all points on the internet. So it's interesting that they decided to regulate it, but at the same time, they acknowledge that they lack the background and practices in addressing internet traffic exchange and vowed to monitor traffic exchange and to develop into the market. But during the course of that, they will address interconnection on a case-by-case basis. We respectfully disagree with the FCC's conclusion. We believe that the market is working and the industry has been able to work things out on commercial terms. And we fear that the dynamism with which commercial interconnection has been able to adapt to rapidly evolving market needs is threatened. And the rules, as they apply asymmetrically, meaning they only apply to broadband ISPs and not maybe a backbone ISP that doesn't serve eyeball customers and content providers and application providers, this asymmetry will likely result in holdups where the negotiating party with the broadband ISP may try and leverage the regulation to get a more favorable outcome than they otherwise would under an open market commercial negotiation. It may encourage rent seeking where a content provider decides, well, I'm not regulated, so I'm going to seek a fee for you delivering my content to your customers. Fortunately, we haven't seen that, but it may occur. And we just feel like the dynamism and under the commercial model will be suppressed. And finally, one thought, I would say that our view is that regulation, if at all required, should be based on evidence of market failure and not based on a predictive judgment of what may or may not happen. And so that in a nutshell is AT&T's perspective.
Thank you very much, Phil. So I think we're going to move right into a roundtable discussion, and I'm going to introduce a series of questions for our panel and try to get each of them to address as many of them as possible. And then towards the end, we can switch to questions from you guys for discussion. So the first one that I'd like to start with is to have each of you just characterize what the establishment of an average interconnection looks like for you, and I'll get started quickly. PCH operates the largest DNS content network in the world, and so we have a bit over 4,000 interconnections. We add roughly 2 a day on average, two per working day. Of those 4,000, 2 are written, and the other 3,900, whatever, are informal. So the way they generally happen is we get an inbound email to peering@pch.net from someone whose email address is peering@somethingelse.net. It says something like, hey, we're present at this exchange point. We see you're there also. We may already have sessions established in other locations. Can we turn up a BGP peering session? Here's what our network does and what we're going to be advertising to you. And we say yes, and it gets kicked over from our peering group to our network operations group to implement. So that happens, as I said, a couple times a day. A bit of automation to make it go smoothly, but mostly it's just email contact and people saying yes. Martin, do you want to go next, and maybe we'll work our way back this way?
Yeah. Okay, so my name is Martin Levy. I work for a content delivery network called Cloudflare. And in a way, I'm just going to completely reiterate what Bill said, but I'm going to adjust it slightly. In the interconnect world, when you're a content player, especially somebody who is trying to optimize the distance between eyeball and content, you actually sometimes don't say yes to every interconnect agreement because you say, I see that you're a network from here on the globe. Well, we'd like to peer and interconnect somewhere close to you on the globe as opposed to somewhere far away. So in a way, it's nearly always a yes with a caveat that interconnects peering, whether it be public or private, are homed into something that has some geographic relevance, that is somewhat closer to the eyeballs, to improve the distance. So this is an aspect of content delivery networks that deploy. We're about 100 plus locations globally. So you have a lot of choices, and you try and optimize it. So that sort of is the very quick answer to the what do we do on a day-to-day basis. But there's also one other subtlety that should bring into the equation. As a network that peers, we also look for locations to build where peering is easy to do, is efficient, and by the way, that also means very cost-effective. So there's a little bit of adjustment when you ask people, well, where do you peer? You have to remember that in some cases you actually build to locations that are good to peer with. And so there's a whole ecosystem of good locations around the world. A very different picture from, let's say, the mid-90s, before this concept truly took place, to now where this is very much part of people's business case. So that's
Is this on? So AT&T has, we're a tier 1 backbone, and so typically tier 1 backbones, some tier 2s and below, will have a peering policy that includes criteria under which we will peer with another network. You can look at it online. It's you just Google AT&T peering policy, and it'll probably be the first thing to return. There are certain criteria that are in that peering policy that are what make it valuable for us to enter into a peering arrangement. Certain level of traffic volume, for example, number of peering interconnection arrangements, the bandwidth for those arrangements, the bandwidth for the backbone of the network that we would peer with, and so it's a peering arrangement is about both providers finding value in the interconnection arrangement, and peering is where, in our perspective, where two networks of, the definition of a peer, that there are two like networks that are providing transport services for one another in order to serve each other's customers effectively. And so that's basically the AT&T perspective on peering.
Hi. Hello?
Yes, that's good.
Is it? Okay. Now it's actually good. So, hi, I'm Christian Kaufmann from Akamai, the little CDN from around the corner. Actually, let me pick up on the definition when we like to peer, or what our definition is. Actually, I think peering is when it is mutual beneficial for both sides, which has a slightly different connotation than what you said, I guess.
I would agree with that. I agree with that.
Okay. A couple of random numbers, because they were flying around, to put a couple of things into perspective. So we actually do different versions. So we either have the concept where we put servers on net, our version of on net, where we basically put it in an eyeball provider, and then the eyeball provider of your choice, where you are getting your last mile, might have own Akamai caches from where you then get delivered. The second option is peering, the one we talk about, various different flavors. We have internet exchanges, a little bit above 110 or so. We have PNIs all around the world, depending on the size of the network. We believe in an open peering policy. So there are no restrictions whatsoever, no preconditions, as long as you're capable of configuring a session on the other side, usually over an IX, then we are happy to do that. We have approximately a little bit over 7,000 of them. And of these 7,000, probably 50 or so, I actually never counted them, are with a contract behind. So that goes in the same direction as what Bill said. You get an email, you set up the session, you meet someone at a conference, whatever the scenario might be, they find you in PeeringDB. All of that applies, but just 50 of them actually had a contract. Usually, the contract is done with bigger networks, usually the ones which have a big legal department on the other side, so that everyone has something to do. But the majority is certainly without any of a big relationship or a paper or much work around, which I think is actually something which is very good. Because if we would have 7,000 contracts written and negotiated, we wouldn't have 7,000 sessions. I mean, the bits which are going over one of these exchanges or some of them sessions would not be cost effective or scalable in any way if that would be the predominant way how we would deal with them. Yeah, I guess that's my version.
Okay. Hi. You got it? You hear me? Okay, there I am. Hi, I'm Nina Bargesen. I work for Netflix. I think it's been mentioned a couple of times today. Not quite sure why. So I am just going to reiterate what has been said already. Netflix has built our own content distribution network. So we're one of those content owners who feel that we can distribute the content more efficiently ourselves. Our model is similar to what Christian described. We peer any sort of flavor, public, private, but we also embed servers from our content distribution networks into ISPs network. So our day-to-day basis on how do we increase our interconnection is, as described, an email arrives either for some ISP requesting peering at some internet exchange or some private peering, or service providers saying, hey, we heard about Open Connect, we would love to take part of that. And then we do have a few evaluations, because when would it be a good idea to embed a server? It has to be a good idea for both parties, Netflix and the ISP. So there's a brief evaluation, and then we basically move on to implementation. For public peering, we have open and private peering. We have an open policy. Nobody gets a no. The only one who can get a no is on the embedded server, where we need a certain level of traffic for it to be worthwhile for both parties. But is that level met, we can move on, and anybody can get a server if we can ship into the country. As for contracts, we are happy to sign contracts, but we are also happy to do handshake. Again, the embedded solution is a little bit different. That do require a contract from our side. But it's a one-page contract, and I have a lawyer who has dedicated his life in order to try and make it shorter and shorter. Yes, and on numbers, I'm not very good with numbers, but I do believe we have around 52 locations where we can do public and private peering globally at this point. The majority of those are still in the US and Western Europe, but we're slowly growing out to the rest of the world. And embedded servers are today also on all continents except Antarctica, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. My name is Falk von Bornstedt. I'm from Deutsche Telekom. And in my private life, I do a little bit of teaching at Technical University in Berlin. On the last meeting, I had a big show here on quality of service. It didn't really happen since then, I must admit. Some people may remember. It's not our fault. People were afraid of the regulators and didn't dare to do it. Yeah. So maybe with 5G, it will come up. We would be prepared. What I can confirm, what we saw, we have this big decrease in IP transit and its highly competitive market. We see a difficulty if you compare the US situation with Europe, because Europe, the customer does have choice. In the US, maybe you have only one or maybe two providers in many areas, and the prices are much lower. The question is, how low do we want to have the price? When I was in Bulgaria, I saw a 100 meg connection for 10 euros a month, and these companies are really struggling to make this, to continue with this for a long time. What we see on the traffic is a big concentration. In our network now, the top 10 is 60% of the traffic. So 10 years ago, we had to deal maybe with 100, 200 ISPs relevant for our business. Today is the top 10 OTTs that make our business. That's what we have. And some people I would like to give a little bit of idea. So say, we are charging for interconnection. So we take money, and some people think it's a whole lot of money. It's not a whole lot. The end customer pay 99 or 98% of the bill, and we are just, the big discussion is about this 1 or 2% that we are charging from our interconnection partners, which raises the emotions. It's less than a thousandth of the Deutsche Telekom revenue, so it's really nothing compared to other revenue sources. But nevertheless, this 1,000th of the raises a lot of emotions on many conferences. So the top 10 account for 60% of the traffic, and the other 53,000 ASN is for the other 40%. This means that the concentration, there's a huge bargaining power on the content side as well. And just one example, if we do a peering contract, we have something like 600 relations where we are connected to other ASN. And I would guess that 95% is on a contract basis, or 96%. There's just 2 handful where we just couldn't agree on a contract. I put it in the personal goals of my peering team many years in a row and just giving up. They need to get some bonus, yeah? It's just not possible to solve certain relationships, and then it works, continues to work without any written contract. Yeah, with the peering contracts, the big OTTs, to show the bargaining power, they sometimes have big legal departments, and we did more than 100 changes on the standard contract to connect them finally after years of discussion. So this is the contract side. Yeah, IPv6 will come later, yeah, this round. So this is about the basics from my view.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon. I'm Sylvie Laperrière from Google. Very similar to Google is an information and content layer. We invest heavily into our infrastructure. We have 15 data centers around the world. We have over 100 points of presence for interconnections. We're present at more than 90 internet exchanges. And we have these interconnection points in roughly 35 countries, last time I counted, maybe a little more. We also have, very much like Akamai and Netflix, a product that is called the GGCs, which are caches that we implement inside the network operator. And we have agreements with a few thousands of partners, and we have them in 195 countries and territories, so it's nearly everywhere. We do believe in open interconnection, and we do believe in free peering or settlement-free peering. We think that the users are the ones that should dictate what is important to them. So they want to see the content, we just deliver it to them. And the best way to do this, the method with the least friction, is with handshake agreements. And we do that with lots of partners. I actually counted, and I can count on the fingers of my hands the number of agreements that we have. So it's very small, but it's got a lot of friction. I think that can keep people busy for many, many cycles. We really believe that what is best for users is competition, choices, and options for them to receive the traffic and their content. So we encourage competing markets, and we're happy to see it.
So next, I'm going to ask a question that not everybody may have a ready answer for. So can you think of examples of interconnection regulation, and do you think that they were appropriate, or do you think that there are circumstances in which it is appropriate for interconnection to be regulated? Anybody want to pick that up? Sure.
Yeah, I know of one example. This is Turkey, where there is some kind of interconnection regulation. I personally think that we have proven as an industry that it works quite well. The internet success story is quite good, and the competition has really shown a big progress every year. So I don't think we need this kind of sector-specific regulation for termination.
I think from our point of view, when we have seen the implementation of the net neutrality in the U.S., we applauded that, and we think we have seen a positive effect on what has happened on the interconnection market after that in the U.S. So we do feel that there is some need for some oversight on the interconnection, because we have ourselves, as we have seen earlier, been subject to gatekeeping and discriminatory policies from end-user networks.
And Nina, could you just describe for the audience in a little bit more detail what that regulation looked like, what the outcome was, and what was fixed?
Well, it's basically the strong net neutrality, that you shouldn't discriminate against services. So what we saw as an effect of that was the charter merger, where it was enforced that settlement-free peering were part of the conditions that the merger was approved on. And we think we have after that also seen more and more networks in the U.S. being interested into entering into peering connections or peering agreements as opposed to what they were before.
So don't confuse what is sometimes defined as regulatory or belief that something is based upon regulatory, when you can in fact actually look at certain either incumbent or ex-incumbent telcos who seem to act as if there is a regulatory pressure to restrict interconnect. We've been quite public about this and called out certain networks in Taiwan, in Australia, in Argentina, and a few other places, and simply said that these are players that are hard to get interconnects with. And in some cases, not in every case, the response has been back, oh, regulatory this, regulatory that, and we actually find that, no, good old honest to gosh commercial self-preservation is what's really going on. And I'm just going to follow this one through a little bit and be very careful about sort of the potential follow-on question. Well, would in fact clarification of if this is regulatory or not help? And in most cases, no. In fact, actually, in most cases, there is a great, sometimes long-winded, but great commercial conversation that can get to the end goal of a better, more well-connected internet, the ability to maybe both be more efficient and more cost-effective in moving bits around, giving the folk, you mentioned the end user paying quite a lot, actually. I don't think that's quite what you meant. But if you actually look at this, ultimately, we're trying to make an end user have a better experience of whatever part of the internet we are responsible for. And so we sometimes, we sort of have to knock through the regulatory conversation and sort of get down to just basic business conversations. And those take time. But we actually seem to be in a world where that slowly but surely actually resolves itself. There's an exception to every rule, and I think the exception that I would bring up, and it's a complicated one which I wouldn't want to get into unless somebody wants to talk to me later, is something weird's going on in Korea, South Korea, that is so hard to explain and is in sometimes claimed to be regulatory in case where the amount of that people want to charge for interconnect has suddenly skyrocketed. And again, a lot of pointers are towards the regulatory world. But that's the only one I can come up with where something just is going in the wrong direction.
Phil? Or Christian?
Couple of comments from my side. So, besides that, we believe that the market is not broken in a way that it actually has to be fixed or regulated, and that for most parts, besides, I'm not sure, someone used the word hiccups today, I think it was you, that for most parts it actually works out. I also have a little bit of difficult actually to imagine how this regulation looks like. The interconnection market is quite fast and dynamic, and I think if someone actually just, when we explain it to either regulators or different bodies, it already has a complexity, how it exactly works, then also putting numbers behind or putting that in a framework, that it is actually better afterwards than it would be before. I have a hard time to see that.
Yeah, I would just say that the concept of settlement-free interconnection is one that you really ought to look at the whole ecosystem and how it's functioned, and how traditionally networks that provide similar services, they find mutual value in peering and doing so on a settlement-free basis. And the typical criteria for that, one of the criteria for what both parties thought was of equal value, was that the traffic exchange was roughly in balance. And there were metrics that said if traffic is out of balance, then we would need to deal with that and negotiate a new arrangement or something. Maybe it's cold potato routing instead of hot potato routing. But if you go back to the history, content providers and CDNs had typically purchased transit service to get their content to the end user. That's now gone from going through purchasing transit service to distributing their interconnections and getting servers closer to the user by getting on-net only connections. If regulators were to decide that settlement-free peering was available to everyone, what that would mean essentially is that that would shift all the cost burden to the end user. Prices would have to rise, number one. And number two, where do you draw the line? Does an enterprise business get settlement-free peering? They look an awful lot, from just a bits perspective, they're users of the internet similar to Netflix or a Google. And so they have typically paid for those connections, whether it's from a transit provider to get to another, the transit provider's peers, customers, or directly from the broadband ISP. So to move to an environment where it's settlement-free peering, that would have to be looked at very carefully because there's a lot going on in that market. It would be extremely disruptive.
Okay. Nina, did you have something else you wanted to say?
Well, I just want to reply a little bit to what you're saying, because I think in some of the things you just said, you're basically confusing, transit or internet access to peering. Because an enterprise, as you said, has usually bought transit to reach the internet, and that cannot be replaced with a peering with their transit provider, because they wouldn't be able to reach the internet then. So there is still a market for transit. Another thing I like to reply to as well is yes, CDNs and content like ourselves used to use transit to distribute to the end users. But what we're investing in today by building our own CDNs is that we are taking on the cost. Instead of using those money on buying access to the internet, we're instead investing heavily in technology that makes our delivery more efficient and provides ISPs with the opportunity of placing our content in their networks where it's most efficient for them to receive it, and bypassing and hence freeing up capacity and ability on the transit network to other services and enterprises to use. So what we're doing is removing that traffic from the big main path that everybody was using before, investing heavily in bringing it closely, and we feel that on those terms, settlement-free connections to the ISPs are reasonable.
Besides that, I liked Nina's comments, of course, a lot, so thanks for that. One additional point. I think in 2016, soon 2017, mutual benefit for peering should not be defined by ratio.
Yeah.
I think we are over that.
So just for the audience, I'd like to make sure you all are able to see what is going on in the conversation here. So of the 6 people up here on the panel, not including myself, we have 2 representatives of large incumbent carriers, right, that are eyeball networks. They have lots of end users that they're serving who are singly homed, right, end users who they have a termination monopoly on. And they've built out a lot of infrastructure over many years to reach those end users. And we have 4 content networks who are all more recently established companies that have direct relationships with those end users. So the end users go to the content networks to get content. And the content network then has to reply back to the customer, right, who is a mutual customer of both the content network and the eyeball network with that data. And so a lot of what you've been hearing here, although couched in very polite terms, is the network neutrality debate, right? Should a content termination, a connection termination monopoly be able to either extract rent from or restrict the performance of a content delivery network that is a supplier to one of the eyeball network's customers? So we've certainly heard both sides of that debate, and you should be aware that it's sort of stacked 4-2 on this panel of 6. So now let's turn to one of the other issues. This is an issue that kind of goes the other direction, and get some opinions on that. Data localization. Data localization is the policy that some governments are beginning to enact, largely post-Snowden, but it has big economic, there are economic rationales for it as well as privacy rationales, that content networks and service providers who are dealing in information should localize that information within the same country as the user. And you can look at, there are essentially 2 different policies that get lumped under the same name, and I will call one a positive and one a negative policy. And these are not value judgments, but instead just sort of a logical differentiation. So positive would mean you must have a copy of this user's data within the user's jurisdiction, right? So if the user is a Dutch national, their personal information must reside in at least one copy on a server inside the Netherlands, perhaps owned by a corporation that has a legal presence in the Netherlands. The negative definition is this user's data may not exist outside the Netherlands, right? So positive is you must have a copy inside the jurisdiction. Negative is you may not have a copy outside the jurisdiction. So again, maybe each of you could weigh in a little bit on data localization. Good, bad, who does it hurt, who does it help?
I'll go first, I think. So if we apply this model, it means that it implies that every country needs to have a data center from all of us. Potentially 2, because you don't want a single copy anywhere. So that's 2 data centers in, what did I say? 195 territories or countries. That is a lot. I'm not sure it's very efficient. And in the end, the users, we would need to pass this infrastructure cost down.
What country do you think doesn't want to have 2 data centers?
They all do, but that's a lot of money to build. So I think it's a significant investment. I'm not sure that the users would be well served necessarily by having a presence by all of us.
And isn't that essentially the goal of your infrastructure deployment operations anyway, to get towards that?
The goal is to at least put locally on the small servers, the caching program, the content that is the most used, the most visible by the users. So it's not exactly what you're describing, but it meets the needs of localizing at least the traffic that is being served to the user. But the storage, the origin of that content may be in any one of those 15.
So is the difference from your point of view one of being able to make a engineering and economic decision for yourself versus being told how to do your business?
I'll say yes to that.
Paul?
Yeah, we do have some customers who have concerns about their personal data, and we are a company who's serving our customers, and if a relevant number of customers have this kind of wish, we try to make products that help these customers doing such things. And we made some good business with some big US companies in setting up data centers in Germany. So the propositions we have to these OTTs, we see a business coming from this. But I agree with you, on a global internet, it's close to impossible to have a 100% solution on that one. But we move into that direction. And we have customer wishes, like a customer last week asking us for a connection to the US that does not pass a sea cable that doesn't pass through UK. These kind of wishes are there. Or some people, South American country, wants to have their data not going via the US, which is also close to impossible. But these kind of wishes we have, but we have a global internet and it will stay global. I don't really see a way of having silos, national silos, per country.
Well, I know that there's been talk in Germany, particularly of a German internet of DKIX and Deutsche Telekom and so forth, being able to provide service that is guaranteed to never pass a bit across the border. Is that something you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I saw this discussion, and the word guarantee really made me very nervous. And I wrote many internal papers writing the word guarantee, please. This is something legal I would like not to see there. So, but I don't have everybody under control in my company.
Can I just want to half answer or follow up from that point. If we take the clock back in Europe 20 years, and Dr. Falk and I actually had this conversation yesterday, you would have seen traffic flow from one university very early, or maybe 30 years, sorry, it was the conversation, from one university in Germany to another university in Germany via the United States. Because back then, the internet, the ARPANET, was predominantly a US-based entity. We have changed. That tromboning, the word tromboning comes from there, that has disappeared. This was an issue in Asia back in the late 90s, and again, has essentially disappeared with a few minor exceptions. I I like the fact that you don't want to use the word guarantee, but you were here 4 years ago discussing QoS, and it's a fine line between those two words. I'm just calling you out on that one, but as a friend. But I'm going to make this comment. Isn't it for all providers in a particular country, a particular locale, a particular region, good for them to optimize their connections such that traffic flows as efficiently? And if that means not over a border, then that's a good thing. That's actually what we're looking for. We're looking for a more efficient, a more cost-effective network, which that should be how that operates, without using the word guarantee. That's how we should end up looking. Is that how you see that?
No, of course, we see we work as hard as we can, and our engineers to have the shortest path within the internet. But the notion of borders is not so. Maybe the UK is a bit separate, but the rest, the continent. So Amsterdam is an integral part of our network. We are serving North Rhine-Westphalia out of Amsterdam. So I see Amsterdam closer to Cologne, Düsseldorf than Frankfurt. We don't want to serve North Rhine-Westphalia out of Germany. So with Amsterdam, it's an integral part.
Yes,
but
that's a great point.
Yeah, we have customers who want the number of services, three-letter services, that have a chance to look at their data to want to minimize this number. We have some people who are concerned about that.
So I'll go back and answer Bill's question now, because that's a great clarification. The data issue is a little bit more complicated than just building data centers. We're not talking about trying to optimize how a web page or a video or a download works, where we do want to move content as close as possible to anywhere. The problem is that these rules deal with where do we store the postal address for that user and their credit card information, and their date of birth, or anything that is considered personal information, yes. And that's actually only a few bytes. It's actually tiny amounts of data, but an enormous programming and operational overhead that eclipses moving big fat lumps of bits.
I disagree a bit. The internet knows about 1,000 parameters about me. It's not only the date of birth. They collect so many things, and you can buy that on the market. So they will collect 1,000 items per person. But it's still not much data compared to any video content.
Yeah, but it's actually quite complicated it's a very simple rule. It seems to make sense, but it adds an enormous level of complexity to
click trails, passive DNS. There's a lot of personal information being collected. And I would like to challenge one thing that Martin just said, which is that tromboning is not happening anymore. We just finished a study for the Canadian government. 5 years ago, 25% of Canadian domestic traffic flowed through the US and back into Canada. Today, 65% does.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned it. The poster child is the Canadian study, which actually shows that life has not got better, and the economics
Some places, yeah.
in some and the economics of moving traffic from Canada down to the US and back up to Canada seems to be prevalent. There's a lot in that study. It's a great. If you haven't, it's IXPmaps.com.
Well, IXMaps is a Canadian University of Toronto project that has been tracking that continuously.
And there's a report.
Like
you've done the
8
report
years
now
or so.
that's taking it a step further.
Yeah.
Yeah, go read it. It's a good report. It's a great report.
But I would agree that in Europe it is certainly not the problem that it was 15 years ago, right? It's not going from Europe to the US and back to Europe, certainly. So anyway, sorry, let's get back to the question about data localization. Who wants to take it next? Yeah.
Well, again, I'm going to reiterate a little bit of what Martin said, that in particular, our CDN is purely constructed on localizing the media content that our members are consuming, but has absolutely no data regarding the members themselves on the servers. All our member data is located in our backend that are centralized locations hosted in the cloud. And as such, it would be a completely rebuild of our entire architecture if we were to comply with such a regulation. So it's absolutely not a thing that we see is necessary. We take our members' privacy very seriously and do whatever we can to secure that the information is solely used by ourselves. We're not selling their end users information or any information that we gather from whatever usage patterns we see. We only use those patterns in order to present better and more directed content for the member themselves, and in order to serve our content more efficiently. No third party gets any insight into those data.
As much as I agreed with Nina and Sylvie before, this is now a little bit where we are different than the others. The reason is we transport content for other companies. We actually do not own the content. So if someone has a connection to a backend and buys something, shopping cart, a video, or whatever we then deliver, we actually don't see the credit cards or the other information. So what we see, of course, is the IP address. Otherwise, we have a little bit of problem to deliver it. But we don't have much of personal information. So in that case, it's a little bit easier for us. Nevertheless, I believe if more and more countries would apply that, then going back to what Sylvie said, either the price is going up, whatever product you have, but you kind of pass that on, right? Whatever you had on efficiency and putting things together, you now fragment. And the other part is, if it doesn't make sense for a particular country, then you don't get that offer in your little country anymore because you have not critical mass. So now we actually exclude countries. And we already do that to a certain point anyway for digital rights management and other components, but that actually would make the fragmentation worse instead of better. And whatever we had as a global internet would go in the wrong direction.
Not being familiar with the issue coming from the United States, I really don't have much to offer other than it sounds extremely complex and capital intensive.
So there was a meeting in Paris earlier in the week where we also treated this issue a little bit. And the policy person from LinkedIn, which is right now in a data localization dispute with Russia.
Not a dispute.
Well, yes, Russia shut them down. Yeah. She pointed out that they have a problem, which is that they apparently track internally a 90-day window of where somebody has been logging in from. So what country is someone in over the last 90 days, thinking that 90 days is longer than somebody goes on vacation or takes a business trip, right? 90 days indicates some sort of more permanent residency. They also track where the person says they are, right, by metro area, and they track where the account was established and a number of different parameters, but ultimately none of this really tells them what jurisdiction should the data be localized in, right? They don't have any single canonical piece of data that tells them this data needs to be held in Taiwan, or this data needs to be held in Australia, or this data needs to be held in Mexico. So that's a pretty fundamental problem for them, right? How would they make that determination? And then the policy person from Dropbox pointed out that they have plenty of documents that they're hosting that are purely international, right? There are 10 people working on the document, and there are not any two of them in the same country. So again, this question of where would the appropriate place be? And then the positive versus negative question makes it very difficult, right? Are people saying that they want the data to be in a certain country or not in other countries? From a European policy perspective, it's pretty clear that the goal is to protect the privacy rights of European citizens from being diminished by the data being held in places that do not extend those privacy rights to those users. The other reason I bring this up is because although it's a very different issue than net neutrality, it's another issue where depending how it is decided, there is a different balance of expense between eyeball networks and content networks. So with net neutrality, if net neutrality goes the way the content networks would like, then they reduce their costs, and potentially the eyeball networks need to pass more of their own costs on to the subscribers, the end users. With data localization, this is essentially mandating that the content networks put their data very close to the eyeball networks, which makes it easy for the eyeball networks to deliver it to their end users and be able to give their end users better performance and reliability and so forth at no additional cost to themselves, but additional build-out cost to the content networks. So these are two very fundamental policy issues that are being dealt with regulatorily right now, each one of which, depending how it's decided, will have major cost implications for one side or the other in this debate. So let's go on to another question. What do we do about the IPv6 problem? We're 20 years in and sitting here at, somewhere between, say, 1% and 6% for most of the world. And, we're out of IPv4 addresses, so NAT is going to start getting very ugly very quickly. What do we do?
So I've seen this year a rise of IPv6, which I find encouraging. Networks that did not send V6 to us are now asking for V6, and now we're establishing those sessions. And I've seen, actually, the US has surprised me. More networks in the US are pushing V6 packets, which they were typically lagging, so it's really good news. But like you, I was looking at your presentation this morning, and I'm thinking, really, after 20 years? Okay, we're ready. Bring it on.
Yeah, I can really confirm Google is the biggest power behind promoting IPv6, also in our network. And of course, others as well. in another role. Of course, there's Hurricane Electric. Everybody knows these people. In our network, it's 10% of our traffic now is IPv6, and it's growing, but not at the speed I would like, but we have 10% of IPv6. And of course, these guys are also pushing IPv6. And over.
Thank you. Yes, so we decided long ago that we needed to V6 enable the service, and to confirm what Sylvie is saying, we are seeing an uptake in Western Europe and the US in particular. Sadly, when I look at emerging markets, it's not looking very good at all. Not that we have that huge amount of volume in those markets yet, so it could be different, but also in general, we're seeing not really anything. So I don't know why that is. I would have expected those markets to embrace V6, and because they do not have the V4 legacy network that the rest of the world has, or the Western world has. But there's one party that we're waiting for, and that is the devices. So we have, our client is V6 enabled for any device that supports V6, but we're still seeing a number of the, in particular, high bandwidth devices like TVs or number of set-top boxes that are not V6 enabled yet, because those producers haven't really seen the light yet.
So that's sounding more like a product regulation issue than a service regulation issue.
Yes.
That a vast improvement could be made if it were not legal to sell retail devices that didn't support V6 at this point.
Yeah, and well, thank you. We are also trying to influence those and saying, well, it's great. We love to have our client on your device, but we would really love to have our client on your device on both protocols. So hope we're getting there at some point.
I don't think that IPv6 is an interconnection problem. So I looked it up. We have, from all the PGP sessions we have, for example, more than half of them are IPv6 enabled, so either dual stack or you have a replacement session depending on where you are. If you look at certain studies, I think, well, actually, my master thesis was 2 years ago about exactly the same topic. Do we actually have enough IPv6 sessions in peerings? And 2 years ago, it already turned out, yeah, you have less than IPv4, but you have them in most of the cities. You have no latency difference, which is significant enough. And the main reason 2-3 years ago, when I collected the data, was actually that the people didn't have enough volume, so they didn't upgrade all the sessions particularly. But by now, I think the backbone, the core, the interconnection has enough IPv6. So if we see less traffic, this is not because the interconnections are not there, in my view. It goes back much more that either the content is not enabled, or that the eyeball provider doesn't have v6 capability, and if one of them fails, then that was the story. So I don't think that this is something where we here, as that group, have a problem. This is a problem on either end.
I wasn't asking you guys to take responsibility for it. I was asking you what we do to make things better.
Well, I don't think we can do much more with the interconnection per se, because that part, I guess, is solved.
And I would agree with Christian. As far as AT&T is concerned, we're 100% IPv6 on our interconnections. So,
Martin, did you get your tattoos removed when you left HE?
Yeah, if you ever wondered where my gray hair comes from.
Jumbo frames.
Yeah. All right, there's an inside joke there, but let me tell you a story. So, I didn't spend 20 years trying to get v6 going. I remember I did a hire about 16, 17 years ago, thinking, right, I'll bring this particular engineer on board, and that'll be my v6 solution. That was an absolute naivete of the nth degree. But yes, I spent an awful lot of time hounding an awful lot of people, both here on the panel and otherwise, and talking to regulators about, v6, it's easy, let's just do it. No, it isn't easy. That was an absolute lie on my part, but it was a motivational technique, and to be honest, I claim that it worked to a certain extent. It got certain people moving forward. Fast forward. So, through the magic of the internet, I'm literally about to publish a blog within the next couple of hours. I'm done. It's out for review. Someone will press publish in the next couple of hours, timed with the US time zone, I'm sorry to say, morning time zone. But it's a story about Cloudflare and IPv6. It's unbelievably apropos to your question. But as of this morning, it wasn't going to get published. It was going to wait till after the American Thanksgiving week. And as of when I walked in here this morning, they said, do it. So let me tell you the story. We've now moved about 4 million different domains, different zones, to being v6 enabled. And over the last couple of months, when we've made that move, the graphs that measure v6 enabled websites in the Alexa million have been creeping up. And about a month ago, somebody said, hey, this number's creeping up. Who's doing what? And my response on social media was to snicker and laugh and say, stay tuned. Well, we moved about 100,000 domains a day. We were very conservative about it. But now we've moved 4 million to be 100% enabled. We can sort of put our hand up and say, look, we've done the content side of the game. We've done our bit, and we hope others have done it. Google did this. Netflix has done this. Facebook has done this. Twitter has not done this, just to call out a particular player. But that's not the cool part about this. The cool part is that 30 to 40% of the traffic we ship you on your AT&T broadband or mobile devices is now being shipped over v6. 30 to 40%, I've forgotten the exact number, is on Deutsche Telekom's network. If I look at Facebook that crawls our network, because every time you social media post something, that social media site, whether it be LinkedIn or Facebook or wherever, will grab a copy. That's how that image shows up. Well, we find 70 to 80% of Facebook's crawl traffic running on v6. There's a piece of code in there that says, oh, I can talk v6 as well as v4, and it seems to be preferring it. Crawl on Google, low. Go fix that. The numbers are staggering. The numbers are far higher when you look at a per network basis. So Orange in France, if I'd looked at these numbers a year ago, and I remember approximately what they looked like, they were next to nothing. And their push for V6 within the last year has actually been quite significant, and now they're sitting in the 20 to 30% range. Cable Deutschland, same thing. T-Mobile in the US, so this is the US version of T-Mobile, very high numbers, above 50%. Google Fiber, I think 40 to 50%. These are measures of complete infrastructure. So it's interconnects. We've all said the same thing. No, interconnects done. We peer with V6 and V4. This is not an issue anymore. But the browser, in other words, the software, the Chrome, the Safari, whatever Internet Explorer is called these days, et cetera, these are all now very V6 savvy. If they implement happy eyeballs, then they're actually a little bit biased towards V6. The content delivery, whether it be out of Google, out of Netflix, Akamai as well, us at Cloudflare, and many, many others, Twitter not being the case, these are doing their part. So we don't need, to get back to the subject, we don't need regulatory help anymore. This is in 2016 finally within certain areas. Oh, by the way, I can mention many networks that are at 0% V6, but they say they're going to change. Sky in the UK, definitely in the 20 to 30% range. Virgin in the UK, a big 0. But UPC, who owns them, or Liberty, or whatever they're called these days, actually are running about 10, 20% of their traffic on V6. So there's hope. This will all change. So this is all happening because people realize it's faster, it's better, it's more cost effective. I don't have to buy carrier grade NAT. And more importantly, if you're a mobile player, you absolutely need to go V6 because the economics and the ability to move bits has fundamentally changed. Not an interconnect issue, but definitely still an issue. And I don't think I have to push too much on it anymore, but other people still do.
So it sounds like we're all kind of exhausted, but we all think it's near the end of the race.
Except for when I average out the numbers and I'm less than 1%. And that sucks. I mean, you know, so let's go look at a lot of the places that aren't in this camp, and let's put the pressure on them. But don't do it regulatorily. Just turn around and say, hey, you know, here's a bunch of mobile networks that do it better. Here's a bunch of broadband. I mean, AT&T moved 5 million people, 5 million households the first year that it did its V6 deployment. You shocked the living daylights out. I mean, you're AT&T, for Pete's sake. I mean, you should be the poster child for not doing things quickly. But you surprised a lot of people in that one area.
And in the US, Comcast was one of the leaders.
Sorry, and
well.
Comcast, Time Warner Cable, but not Charter, interestingly. So yeah, there are some good stuff happening.
Okay. Well, so we have 25 minutes left in this session. Does anyone in the audience have a question they'd like us to address yet? Yes, Rudolph.
We've heard about the prices of transit dropping, and that's because there's a competitive market. We haven't heard about the prices of paid peering. Could anybody comment on what the prices of paid peering are? Because there is a termination monopoly, of course, and well, it would be interesting to know how that is developing in the market.
As a content provider, it would be very hard to confirm that prices have dropped.
Well, providers have choices. They can purchase transit. They can go direct with an on-net connection. An on-net only connection is going to be cheaper than transit. And you're dealing with larger volumes of traffic with an on-net only connection. It's benchmarked against. It's going to be benchmarked against transit. So if a provider wants to go direct doesn't like the price, they can always go back to a transit provider that's connected to the peer. They don't have to pay the eyeball ISP in that scenario.
So Philip, you and I need a coffee after. I cannot confirm that on-net rates are declining as fast as transit rates. It's actually the opposite.
So the reason why you guys are getting very carefully guarded statements here is because the on-net pricing or the paid peering or whatever typically come with non-disclosure agreements. And since there are so few of these agreements, it's very easy to tell who has broken a non-disclosure agreement if, for instance, pricing leaks out. So in a forum like this, you're not likely to actually get a specific answer from anyone other than just non-confirmations of hypotheticals. Any other questions from, sir?
Yeah, it's still on-net interconnection. I would like to know more about the preferred business models for on-net interconnection. Is it actually organized by the ISP itself, by the content application provider, by third parties like CDNs? And also, is it true, because we heard a lot of figures in France, that it is growingly turning into the preferred option for interconnection overall?
Yeah, Sylvie, you invented it because Google prefers it, right? Yeah, go right ahead. Yes, please.
Can I clarify something you said? And I don't know whether a fellow CDN in the panel here is going to agree with me, but you used the word third-party CDN as if there's any difference between, let's say, a first-party content player. And besides, Christian's already made this comment, we don't own the data. As a content delivery network, we are basically providing an acceleration, a protection of a website. The thing that I would argue is that it is no different whether you're dealing with a third party or a first party in this situation. And in fact, actually, first party will, for all intents and purposes, disappear. The concept of running a naked website, the one that's unprotected, the one that isn't accelerated and distributed globally, that is an origin server directly talking to a destination, this is pretty soon going to be a thing of the past. And whether it's our content delivery network or somebody else's content delivery network or a specific content delivery network for a specific usage, the concept of distributing content away from a single point to multiple points will become the de facto standard. So saying that as a stated future, and I'm biased because I work for a content delivery network, and I understand that. But going back to your question, do you really mean content delivery networks as a completely separate entity, or do you accept this premise that it's just content? I mean, sort of yay or nay, and I'll gladly repeat it.
No, my question was to understand who was actually selling on-net solution to ISP. Are they organizing it themselves? Are they using the capacities of third-party players like CDN?
Okay.
Or is that done by content and application provider locating servers within the network of given ISPs? What is the preferred model right now?
So repeating the question, because that's, I think, the right thing to do. Is these relationships organized by the content players or the content delivery networks, or by the eyeball, the broadband mobile networks? I would say, should such agreements happen, they can happen from either side. Both players know exactly what's going on here. Don't get me wrong. The lack of response from some of us here, let me explain it, is partly due to who you are in the audience. And you know that. And secondly, we all do know each other. And we all know what the traffic patterns are and the traffic levels and the traffic distributions. And we know that there are conversations to be had. Whether they occur or not is not an answer you're going to get in this forum. Whether the traffic flows is easy. Go look at MLabs. Go home and see whether Netflix works. Go home and see whether Microsoft Update works or whether Taylor Swift's website still works. If it does, then we're all doing our job. How well it's working is a different question.
You have Taylor Swift.
And we have Metallica.
I actually cared more about the first one. Now I'm jealous. The lack of response was actually mainly because I was confused about the question. So I'm sorry for that. So I guess everybody waited for the other one to figure out what the question was about. I start and then we see if the others correct me for their models. But I guess at least for the ones which have an on-net solution, I think it's a similar point. So the on-net part, which is basically you get usually physical servers in a specific way. When you reach a certain traffic level, I guess we established that before, then you can apply. Either the CDN reaches out to you and say, I think you really should have that because it's cool. Or you figure it out and say, oh, I really should have that, it's cool. And then you contact them. If you have enough traffic, then usually, so that it makes sense, then you usually get them. I think that is true for all three of us, is that you don't pay for them. So they get shipped. You install them in a data center of your choice, wherever your networks are. You might get more than one, depending on how the country is organized. In France, that usually means Paris. And then the content gets delivered from there. This, of course, helps besides of traffic, which is very latency sensitive, so that might be shopping carts or that kind of stuff. It helps, of course, also with videos. First of all, ideally, you don't have to drag the whole video through your backbone. You can put the clusters closer to the end users. You get a higher throughput. You have a lower latency, right? Everything which goes to 4K, and that's probably more Nina's part. It really benefits if it is closer to the end user. So if video is the majority of the traffic and you get that kind of traffic from the box, then one could assume that that part probably grows faster than peering sessions or transit traffic. Is that kind of the answer to the question-ish?
Well,
The functioning is clear for me.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if actually for the cache servers were located within the network by the ISP itself, and then, for example, Google or other players were storing their content within ISPs cache servers, or if it was actually Google servers within the network of the ISP, or if it was Akamai server or whatever.
so the content networks will pretty much always supply a server. They provide the capital, the CapEx, right? They supply the server, they ship it to the eyeball network. The eyeball network then is free to install it pretty much anywhere they like in their infrastructure. And the eyeball network then from that point forward takes over the operational expense of the cache fill bandwidth, right? So this is an efficiency for the eyeball network if the eyeball network is large enough, right? If they're large enough, then the cache fill transit is cheaper for them than the amount of transit that they would have had to use to get out to somewhere else, or even perhaps than the amount of internal transport they would have had to use to meet the content network at an exchange point, okay? So this is a trade-off that both parties enter into willingly and with their eyes open. Now, where it gets a little trickier is in places that are geographically remote, where they desperately want the better performance or higher reliability because it's not as dependent on their upstream transit, but they don't have the volume of traffic to necessarily warrant paying for that cache fill, right? So, you know, in Africa and parts of Latin America, so forth, it becomes, it starts to look a little less equitable. But this is all a very separate question than, okay, very separate question than what the relationship between a, for instance, a Google and an AT&T looks like, where it's not Google saying, here, have some free servers, and AT&T saying, thank you, we always wanted those. Not to pick on two people here. Other quick. Go ahead, Nina.
Can we point out to AT&T that this is where the mutual benefit comes up?
Some people say they're dropping the traffic off on the doorstep, and I like to say there's an awfully long, expensive hallway to the end of that to the end.
Go ahead. Get a mic over here.
Marco.
Maybe you can just repeat. Martin, yes. Thank you, Martin. Marco, right? And see, I wanna quickly jump back to IPv6, and I fully agree with the conclusion of the panel that the lack of IPv6 is not an interconnect problem, but the other way around. How much does IPv6 has impact on interconnection, and more in terms of how often do you find yourself back at the negotiation table if you want to enable an already established thing? Coming back, and I've been a bit rusty because I've been out of the pairing game for almost 10 years now. Connecting is hard, but disconnecting is sometimes even harder. There's a lot of IPv4 legacy out there that you might not get on IPv6. Is that still the case? Or?
Martin, can you talk about HE Cogent from the perspective of someone who is no longer in the middle of that fight?
No.
Anybody else?
The problem, yes, there are issues. And although, yeah, I've been out of that particular conversation for a couple of years, I can generalize it. Marco brings up a very good point. When there were legacy relationships, going back to the table to discuss something which sort of should be trivial, like, oh, let's just make sure we enable v6 over these umpteen locations where an existing interconnect, can suddenly become the opening of a whole new set of negotiations. And so, in reality, the whether it be on paper or as a handshake, there is examples out there, the one that I won't talk about, of why certain relationships will come back and haunt you in one way or another. But I firmly believe that this is an issue which will still get resolved by commercial relationships. And sometimes these things just take many, many, many years to get flushed out. But I think the good news is that there are very few examples of coming back into the world of v6 as being a stopping point for people.
Yeah. So I think one of the issues with v6 is because it's been perceived as being kind of low stakes and nobody's really dependent on it and so forth, people have been willing to play much harder ball in the v6 area than they've been willing to in v4 for a long time. So there are paying customers in v6 land who cannot talk to each other because they happen to be on the wrong sides of peering disputes, unbeknownst to them. And so if they're, I think the argument that this is all stuff that will work itself out commercially is fine in the v4 space where everyone can in fact talk with everyone else, and in the very rare instances when that stops working, it's very publicized and people step in immediately. I think in the v6 land there are customers who've been unable to talk to each other for years now, and part of growing up and being taken seriously is fixing that, and that may require regulatory intervention, no?
Slap a few people around.
Or the threat of it. Yes, question.
Bill, you mentioned the term net neutrality, and I would like to know, is there a clear-cut distinction between IP interconnection issues and net neutrality issues, or does it really overlap? And what is your expectation? Do you expect that in the future that there will be more interconnection issues rather than real net neutrality issues? What do you think?
Anybody want to jump on that? All right. Oh,
Well, I
or
can-
Nina, go ahead.
Well, we truly believe that it's two sides of the same thing. We talk about what we call strong net neutrality, which is a way of extending the term, and it's all about discriminating traffic. So, in order to make sure that traffic is not discriminated anywhere, the principle needs to be extended into interconnection, and then we start talking about interconnection, and we have, again, the whole concept of gatekeeping and on restricting access to certain services in order to extract payment. And we think that is something that should not be done. So net neutrality does, in fact, very much cover interconnection.
I think it's difficult to reduce this to, like two single axis questions, right? I think this is a whole field that keeps hundreds, perhaps thousands of people busy around the world all day. And we have issues around whether networks are interconnected. We have issues around whether they're interconnected within a jurisdiction or country or somewhere else. We have issues around the performance, and if there are performance problems, who needs to cure those problems. We have issues around whether there's coercive behavior involved, whether there are fees being charged in ways that are not beneficial to the public or not beneficial to the industry. There are just a multitude of different issues, all of which can be in play simultaneously, particularly when there are really bad problems, right? I mean, when two networks are actively fighting something out, they may be pushing on each other in many of these axes simultaneously. Anybody else on this?
Yeah, so on one side, I think there are two very different things, but they belong together because you need both, or you have to cover both bases to actually solve the problem. So the peering part or the interconnection, whatever you want to call it, of course, is the question how much access do you have in a particular network. What then happens actually with a bit afterwards might not be specified, and someone might come to the idea to sell you a premium gold service, or you might find oversubscribed links afterwards, and then your bit doesn't go through, or you might come via a transit or something completely different. But then you have like a gold service or not gold service, and then everything works from there on. So you've got to figure out both, right? The access, but also how you travel through that network to the end user. There are not so many networks who want to sell, or not even sure if sell is the right word, who offer quality of service or anything like to the end user, or actually go into that debate of network neutrality, right? Because the topic is kind of loaded and difficult, so not many say actually make a statement how they would handle your bit afterwards or offer that, at least in the fixed line business, what I have seen. But end of the day, you need both, right? If one of them fails, then the other one doesn't work. So.
All right. Well, we only have 5 minutes left, so I'll wrap it up with a quick one. Each of you, are you already one of the 1,021 participants in the Jakarta multilateral? Are you going to be in the future? What do you think about these multilaterals? They seem to be taking off.
Big time, apparently. I don't know exactly about the Jakarta one per se. From a multilateral perspective, more in general, I guess if you have an open peering policy per se, and we talk now about IXs, to narrow it down, then you don't necessarily have a problem with it, right? You connect. It helps us often to bootstrap. So instead of configuring 500 sessions at the DKICs or 600-700, you configure the route server and then you have time for the rest. To do that one by one. So it helps to enable your service, but some of them find it particularly interesting, and I'm not sure if it's still true, but the Hong Kong AX or the one in the Ukraine said you also have to announce your local prefixes and do this and this and that. And made a policy around to enforce certain parts. And then we are not a particular fan of, even with an open peering policy. I think it actually changes the entrance bar, and then particular player not interested to apply to these rules, and then they don't even join the AX.
So for Akamai, you do them as long as the multilateral follows the commonly accepted peering rules?
No, we even do it like in the former Hong Kong AX, and I'm not sure if they actually still do it. We still did it there because it didn't harm us, but we didn't find it a good idea because then it doesn't encourage other peers to come, right? So we actually believe it doesn't strengthen the IX, it hurts the IX by over-regulating it.
I think. So on the surface, a multilateral at an IX looks like a good idea. In some cases, it's a great starter position, which you can then follow up with direct peering. But there are cases where it's actually detrimental. The two examples you gave are actually slightly different than each other. The Ukrainian one is just weird. But let me give you the Ukrainian example in context and then one more from Argentina. In Ukraine, there are now, or in Kiev, there are now 3 major IXs. The one that has a forced multilateral peering agreement is the one that has now, is the third. In other words, it was the number 1 player. It is now not even the second player in the city. The other 2, which have a much softer, if not just a neutral requirement, although they have route servers and they have multilateral peering, they're actually now bigger exchanges. And the one with the forced rules has basically hit the number 3 spot. In Argentina, the Cabase internet exchanges, which use the Brazilian model of existing in multiple states, in multiple provinces, has a very forced multilateral agreement, which seems to be detrimental to getting the large players to even be in the same building as the exchange. So again, it seems to be great for the small players, but it actually has been detrimental to the large players, which therefore is detrimental to the small players.
You aren't breaking their rule against advertising non-Argentine prefixes across the exchange, are you? You realize there's a rule that says you can't.
Sorry, it's actually worse than that. No, the actual requirement was for us to break that rule. So the rule made no sense for any player that wasn't Argentinian, because our routes in Latin America are actually registered in Costa Rica because of legal reasons. Yes. So the rules do cause problems for themselves, but they also cause problems for players like us as a content network coming anywhere close to that IX. Hong Kong is a weird one. It actually does have a rule. To this day, it still has a requirement for you to announce all your routes if you're a member there.
Sorry, the Hong Kong local routes, as far as I remember.
Yes, Hong Kong, sorry. We run an Anycast network, so that means all our routes. So yes, I'm sorry. That's correct, local routes. But it is such a long-standing internet exchange that has been party to the interconnect world in Hong Kong, that in a way not too many people worry about it anymore. Like you just let it live. It has lost a few players. It's lost a few big players, mainly international players. But there are other IXs in the in Hong Kong that have taken up some of the slack. So yes, it's okay to interconnect with the multilateral route servers, but I don't think it's the be all and end all. And definitely, if they're regulated as required, then it ultimately has a problem.
Any of the rest of you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, lots of our traffic is now with big OTTs. As I said before, it's focusing on top 10, and there we are rolling out on a terabit layer. It just would warm the planet to have something like an IX in between. So it just doesn't make any sense to have an extra point of failure in between. So the big things happen on a direct interconnect. And we don't, our engineers don't believe in shared infrastructure. So we have this on a very, on direct interconnects, with the big traffic.
I think multilateral is part of your portfolio of interconnect options. So we welcome it. We'll pair on the route servers. It allows us to get much deeper into a market. We also do like to do sessions over the IX.
All right. Well, we're just barely over time now, so I think. I have
one last question.
Okay.
Being a regulator, having heard a lot of ambiguous things about regulation during this session, and you getting around the question of what you believe should be, whether there should be some regulatory measures. You were talking about tromboning, for instance, considering it as a problem. Is there any concrete advice as to whether there are any measures you would consider reasonable?
Well, I think I think she's fishing for a specific answer. I think each of us would probably give a slightly different answer to that. As someone who's spent 25 years building internet exchanges, what I tend to favor is very technology neutral regulation that nevertheless encourages the formation of exchange points and domestic peering and so forth. I think the data localization, there are a lot of people who just refer to data localization as an evil and don't bother to delve into that with arguments pro or con. And I look at that as something that, particularly in the sort of post-Snowden era of taking responsibility for the privacy of your citizens, it's got quite a lot of good arguments, right? And different ways of formulating that can have some pretty beneficial effects, right? One of the simplest ways is the regulatory formula. If the traffic source and the traffic destination are inside the country, you may not pass the traffic across the national border, right? It's a very simple formulation, has a lot of beneficial effects. It would take care of the Canadian to US tromboning problem 100%, right? There are very few good arguments against that other than for big international networks who say, well, you know, I want to be able to route the traffic however I want to route it, which is very much the same argument that the CDNs have around the data localization, saying, you know, I want to be able to store the traffic where I want to store it without regulatory interference. So I think, you know, each of us would probably have a slightly different position on these things, and my position is probably not quite the same as any of the other people on the panel. Anybody else?
Oh, I had a closing statement, but I have to change it. All right, my closing statement is very quickly. If you really want to learn about this subject, yes, listen to all the panels today, but go to a network operators conference, take your jacket off, take your tie off, just go to who has done this in the past? Yeah, you see, yeah, actually more, because there's a few people I've met over the years. But my point is, go and drink a beer and listen to operators. They'll tell you more than we would ever do on a microphone, but listen. So now I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to give you a great example of a regulator that I love and I have great respect for. The NTRA in Cairo, Egypt. This is the telecom regulator. The NTRA actually runs an internet exchange for probably the last 15, maybe not quite 20 years.
2001, I think.
Yeah, 15 years. And they run an internet exchange with a very specific and very well-worded regulatory requirement. If you get an international license, the ability to run bandwidth out of the country, you must connect to this internet exchange in order to keep all Egyptian traffic inside the country. You can't get, I'm very, very much paraphrasing, but you can't get simpler than that. The government wants all traffic within inside the country to stay within inside the country, and we don't really disagree with that. Oh, and the regulatory body says, we're running an internet exchange, and we want you to connect to it. Again, sounds pretty good. And by the way, this is only valid for 7 networks. There are only 7 networks that have an international license within inside Egypt.
But there's something like, what, 50 participants at that exchange, so there are a lot of people who participate.
Okay, you're jumping ahead. There were 7 participants and yourself, because you got in as a domain DNS operator. But even before that, there really were only 6 or the 7 licenses. The downside is the reality of life if you're a government, and if you're the Egyptian government. You run out of money, you can't expand the internet exchange, you can't put in new hardware, you can't get more bandwidth into it, and really, in reality, a smaller percentage, maybe be 30 or 40% of the traffic inside the country stays within inside the country, because there are practical aspects of running any form of interconnect, whether it be an exchange or whether it be a private interconnect, a network connection between 2 networks, private network connection between 2 networks. So it's important that, and the parable or the takeaway from this is, if you're going to regulate anything, make sure it still helps the internet grow, because we're in the business here of making the internet grow at astronomical levels. The graph that you showed, which is really the only up and to the right graph that we have to point to here, that's a tiny part of the graph. It is, every aspect of what we're doing is growing dramatically. So be very careful that if you put a set of rules in place, that you haven't actually stopped something happening in the process. Because the consumers are watching more video, they're tweeting more, they're Instagramming more, the CDNs are deploying more locations. People are buying more of these things than you know how to count. Every vector is increasing.
Yeah, I think it's really important not to be over specific in the regulation, because the moment you mandate anything specific, it's not going to be the thing that doubles in size every 10.5 months. And the internet has been doubling in size every 10.5 months for almost 40 years now. So if you get too specific and say you got to use this exchange point, and the regulation in Egypt doesn't say you have to use that specific exchange, I don't think.
The only one.
Right. Well, no, there was.
GPX has one.
Yeah.
No one uses
right. It's the only one that's even moderately successful, unfortunately. And they're trying to get some more going, and so forth. But the point being, if you mandate a specific one, that may not be the one that the market chooses to make successful, right? So you want to step back from that, I think. All right. Well, we are definitely over time now. So thank you all very much. And I think everybody on the panel is happy to answer questions in the hallway or whatever. Thank you all.